morning everyone, I am Glenn Ramos Agoncillo, and together with this report is Jessrin Ponlaon. So we'll be discussing and focusing into letting you understand what is the history of multicultural education and the US schooling. So I will be the first one that will have to discuss all about history of multicultural education. So bear with my face for a while as I will be discussing all about this topic. So let's begin our discussion. So before anything else, let me have this kind of questions. These questions will be our guide into the understanding of what multicultural education is, if there really is an integration of multicultural education to the education that we know today. And at the end of my discussion, at the end of my presentation, I will also we are also going to look back at this one and reflect and answer all of the questions, reflect based on the things that we'll be discussing regarding the brief history of multicultural education. So let's start. Let me read this one first. What did the earliest form of multicultural education look like, and what social condition gave rise to them? Second one, we have what educational and philosophies provided the framework for the development of multicultural education. And the third one, we have how has multicultural education changed since its earliest conceptualization? So that will be the questions. But before we go through the brief history of multicultural education, let us first understand what is multicultural education, because we cannot go through the brief discussion of the history of multicultural education without really understanding what multicultural education is. So we will just have a glimpse of the definition of it, because there will be another reporter that will be discussing this one. So let's have this. What is multicultural education? So it is defined that multicultural education refers to any form of education or teaching that incorporates the histories, texts, values, beliefs, and perspectives of people from different culture backgrounds. So if we look here, the multicultural, you do have two terms. So we have multi and cultural. So what do we mean about the word multi? Multi is when we are talking about two or more concepts. That is multi, while cultural is all about understanding different kind of creative culture and creative ties that identifies a specific culture. So that is multi and cultural. So if you were thinking, if we merge together, multicultural is the understanding of the diverse culture that is just in the surface of understanding the identity of a different group of people, then you are wrong, because multicultural is very broad. It's very it's valuing the diversity of the cultural differences. It's all about understanding the roots that complements every individual that is within the culture. So it is the study of the specific and general concept of the diversity of culture. That's why it's a very intricate and complicated. It go deeply into the understanding of the different kind or diverse cultures. So multicultural is all about the understanding of the roots of the cultural differences or the diverse understanding of different kind of culture. So when we integrate multicultural into an education, it means that we integrate a very diverse culture into a system of education that letting the student understand different kind of education that they need to learn, and by able to understand that opens their mind into the subjective concept and focus into the understanding of the diversity of culture that allows them to become creative or critical thinking and logical into understanding different kind of concept that is happening in the world. And this also opens their moral conscience to respect a different kind of people with different racial background in a way that is normal and not enforced by any law. So let's look at into the brief history of multicultural education. So let's start the brief history and understanding the history of multicultural education, the integration of multicultural education in the 1960s to early 1970s. As you know, education in America is so oppressed, so they excluded different kind of group of people because they believe that their race is much more intellectual than other people. They believe that their race is the only one who's capable of great thinking. So that's why in these 1960s to early 1970s, it is the heart of civil movement. This allows black people to raise their voice because, as you know, black people is not really seen as someone that needs to be respected or should be allowed into educational system because they are being looked as if they are just slave and they are just a garbage in the society in the 1960s. Therefore, they're not allowed an education they deserve to have. So this enables them to open their hearts into the fight of, voicing out the things that they need to, have the privilege that they need to have, particularly in the education that they deserve to have. And because of this, this act of activism, this allows them to be given the things that they want, be involved into the system of education. Colored groups of people be involved into an education that they deserve to have. And because of this one, this gives rise to a different kind of movement, a movement of women's right movement, which joined the push of education reform. Because we know women are seen to be not intellectual compared to men at that time, so they're not allowed to enter the system of education. They're not allowed to enter or have an education because they are seen to be someone who doesn't have any brain to work on into understanding a different kind of concept. So that's why this revolution, this movement rise into their voice that let them be able to let women be able to experience an education because they deserve so, and they also have to voice for the reform of education that is focused into allowing different kind of gender to be part of an education. So in the 1960s, we see that there really is a multicultural integration because there is a change of the educational system from the allowing color people or people in colors be allowed into the education. Therefore, there is an integration of multicultural education because there is a different kind of cultural diversity that is involved into the system of education, and this turns to give inspiration for the women's movement in order for them to enter also the education. So this, we see that there is a reform, there is an integration of multicultural education into the system of education that they have in 1960s. And among these movement, there also some movements, also movements that is with regards to gay and lesbian groups and elderly people. Lesbian and gay are requesting that they should be able to express themselves the way they want, and that binary perspective into presenting themselves must be abolished, because they must present themselves in any kind of location the way they want themselves to be presented. So that is what they voice out, that change also the education, or the change the culture of education in that time, where it allows gay and lesbian to wear uniforms that they are comfortable of wearing in the school. And also elderly people urges to be part of the system of education, even if they're old, as long as they are capable of doing the job, and also be able to be educated even if they're old, without any discrimination or prejudice with regards to the concept of old people should not study because they're already old. So that is what they voice out. And there is also an integration of different kind of culture, the culture of understanding and adjusting the educational curriculum, that educational culture that allows gay and lesbian and elderly people to cope with the system of education that is already built. So therefore, there is multicultural education, an integration of multicultural education in the 1960s to early 1970s. So in the 1960s to early 1970s, we can really define that it is the earliest conceptualization of multicultural education. So what do we think about the word conceptualization? Conceptualization is all about the reimagining or the new birth of a concept, or a new integration of different kind of aspects. So we defined the earliest conceptualization multicultural education. We've seen there in our brief history that there really is a conceptualization multicultural education. There is introduction of the reform of the educational system, from letting black people enter the education. There is a change in the culture of education. Women be involved in the education system, elderly people and LGBT community be able to express themselves in the community that they are in the community of educational system. And this is really the time of conceptualization, and that allows new perspective in increasing the idea of really innovating and transforming the education that they have. In 1980s and mid and late 1980s, there also a rise of problem. We have already created in the 1960s to 1970s, the educational system is already in a reform. However, some of the progressive teachers or progressive individuals say that this integration of education only allows different kind of books that represent the colored people, or people that is in color. So that's why they really need to change the educational system as a whole, that would really integrate every individual into understanding different kind of culture. That's why the emergence of a body of scholarship on multicultural education by progressive education activists. So they have hired the scholars that is focused into the reform of the curriculum, that is not only coloring some books that represent the people in color, but really integrating diversity, particularly into the curriculum itself, transforming it into a curriculum that really gives different kind of diversity to be learned and able to strengthen the critical thinking of every student, and also become less visibly white. And because of the change of curriculum, it is less visibly white. The cultural perspective of white education is eliminated because it looks into the diversity of education or the diverse way of implementing education. That's why it becomes less white, where the education is less into the perspective of the culture of white people. Also, it is less Christian because of the curriculum has changed and it is focused now into understanding the diversity of different kind of culture that makes it visibly rich with culture, racial and ethnical and religious diversity. They are now focused into understanding the cultural and the diversity of cultural implementation perspective of different kind of people in the world. So they become subjective into understanding concepts and not objective into only understanding what the Bible only says. So that really is a great reform and the great conceptualization in terms of multicultural education into the system of education in the 1980s, mid and late 1980s. So there in the let me clear this one. This happens, the emergence of body scholarship and multicultural education happens in 1980s and mid 1980s. In the late 1980s, that kind of problem is already resolved. So there is another kind of problem that is integrated into that because of the increase of technological progress. Therefore, the education needs to blend into the use of technology into letting the education be strengthened and let the student be able to understand different kind of concept with the integration of technologies. And in the late 1980s, they are much more into the struggle of integrating technology that can suit to the learning or the improvement of the knowledge of every student. So that is the cultural or multicultural education struggles of the late 1980s. And we can really say that there really is an integration of multicultural education. There is a conceptualization of cultural education because it really changes in every century. There is really a change or a reform of education that really gives transform in order for the education to be able to be in a path of diversity and cater the needs of every student into realizing that the world is beautiful, the world is creative, the world is unique, and there are so much that we need and we can learn into the concept of the world. So today, multicultural education is much more it's very diverse actually. You can really say that education right now is still into the process of improving, but still it is more into a very rigid curriculum where different kind of color, different kind of racial perspective and racial identity is already respected, regardless of who you are, regardless of what you think you are, or what identity that you holds. You are subject to the right for an education. So there is still multicultural education until now, because there is always really a change of curriculum. There is always a change of perspective. There always will be a reform of educational system because there is different kind of needs to a different kind of century. So, as we can see, there really is multicultural, or the conceptualization of multicultural education. There really is an integration of multicultural into the system of education that tends to change and give rise to a particular education that is good to all particularly to the different kind of people. So let's go back to our question and let's reassess if we do really understand the multicultural history, the brief history of multicultural education, and if we do really reflect into what multicultural education is, and if there really is an integration of multicultural education. The first question is, what did the earliest form of multicultural education look like, and what social condition gave rise to that? So, multicultural education, you know already that multicultural education in the 1960s is called brutal because they are more focused into letting white people be integrated into the educational system. And there is really a rise of social change in terms of multicultural education when black people fight for their social integrity and social right to be part of an education, and women revolution and different kind of groups that leads to the reform that is the first reform of the education that integrates multicultural perspective into the changing the culture of education. So, second question is, what educational philosophies provided the framework for development of multicultural education? So, philosophical framework, there are different kind of philosophical framework that provides development of multicultural education. And so, the framework is those activity or those, ideas that changes the culture of education. Those are the framework, or the things that had happened are the framework in changing the culture of education. That's it. So here is the last one. How has multicultural education changed since its earliest conceptualization? So if we compared how multicultural education in the last century today, it's really different because it really improved, and the multicultural education that we are experiencing right now is kind of, much more rigid, and it's much more solid, that allows the diversity of concept to be really realized. So there is a great improvement in terms of multicultural education to the system of education, or integration of multicultural education. But don't forget that there always will be multicultural integration or multicultural education until now, because there will be a change of curriculum based on the needs of the century. Therefore, multicultural education, or the integration of multicultural education, or conceptualization of multicultural education doesn't have any end. It always circling in the improvement of the system of education. So I think that's all, and I hope that you understand all the things that I discussed to you today. So I am done with my topic, so let's welcome Justin Ponlaon for the discussion that is all about the US schooling.
Hello everyone, this is Justin Ponlaon. So our report with Glenn Agoncillo is the United States History of Education. So let us talk first with the early history of education in the United States, 17th century. So in the 17th century, education was not a requirement. For many, education was a dream. Societal needs emphasized children help the family at home or on the farm. Even if children had the luxury of getting an education, they were often taught by a family member in their home. So the main purpose of education in the United States at this time was to teach children how to read the Bible and how to align themselves with Puritan morals. So once the settlers' population started to grow, each colony was required to have at least one school teach students academics, but these schools mainly focused on educating the wealthier population. Although education was considered less important at the time, Harvard was established as the first college in 1636. More than a century later, that first academy for girls was established in 1797. Teachers themselves were expected to be models of strict moral behavior. By the mid-80s, most states had accepted three basic assumptions governing public education. So, number one is that schools should be free and supported by taxes. Two is that teachers should be trained. Three is that children should be required to attend school. So the term normal school is based on the French École Normale, at 16th century model school with model classrooms where model teaching practices were taught to teacher candidates. This was a laboratory school where children on both the primary or secondary levels were taught and where their teachers and the instructors of those teachers learned together in the same building. So this model was employed from the inception of the Buffalo Normal School, where the School of Practice inhabited the first floors of the Teacher Preparation Academy. In testament to its effectiveness, the campus school continued in the same tradition after the college was incorporated and relocated on the Elmwood campus. In the 19th century, education philosophy experienced a paradigm shift from privilege, religiously based on education to common, state-sponsored education. After society embraced this new philosophy, the first public school in the United States was established in 1821. In 1867, education in the United States received a major boost. The Department of Education was established. George Peabody donated $2 million to help public education in the South, and Howard University for African American students was established. By 1870, public schools were present in every state, with secondary public schools outnumbering private schools. However, 3 years later, in 1873, an economic depression hurt formal education. Many schools closed because they lacked the funds to staff the school with teachers and supplies. So let us talk with the 20th century education in the United States. By the 1920s, the United States education system bounced back. As children were transitioned from factories to public schools, the Association of American Universities was created. The Progressive Education Association was established in all 50 states with an agreement to fund transportation to school children. So, segregation in schools went to the Supreme Court in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. Following this monumental decision, schools in the South began the slow process of desegregating schools. As segregation came to an end in the 1970s, schools in the United States now had a new problem to tackle, which is the technology. So let us talk with the 20th century education in the United States. By the 1920s, the United States education system bounced back. As children were transitioned from factories to public schools, the Association of American Universities was created. The Progressive Education Association was established in all 50 states with an agreement to fund transportation to school children. So, segregation in schools went to the Supreme Court in 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education. Following this monumental decision, schools in the South began the slow process of desegregating schools. As segregation came to an end in the 1970s, schools in the United States now had a new problem to tackle, which is the technology. So let us go to modern day education. So technology started making its way into the classroom with the introduction of the calculator and computers in the 1970s. Processing machines like calculators and computers also slowly made their way into the classrooms. Calculators became smaller and more affordable. Questions were raised among educators of how the tool would change mathematical instruction. As computer science strong, companies such as Apple started donating them to universities. As the years progressed, these processing machines became smaller, more affordable, and more advanced. Endless possibilities were imagined by educators and scientists alike. By the 1980s, computer-aided instruction was common in both K-12 and higher education. By 1990, multiple computers could be found in classrooms nationwide, leading to the technological revolution.